watching a woman trapped in a room. Below is an expanded version of your account, maintaining its general style and narrative while improving grammar where needed and extending the text to approximately 4,000 words. All names, places, and personal details have been left intentionally vague in keeping with your wish for discretion, while also conveying your story in greater detail. 3 years ago, I was scrolling through local job classifieds online. At the time, I was working as the manager of a music store, a position I both enjoyed and hated in equal measure. Managing a store had its perks, like having some autonomy and a decent salary, but the company's direction felt uncertain. Deep down, I already suspected that the rumors of closing down were more than just office gossip. The music industry was shifting, the store's sales were poor, and everyone knew that a wave of downsizing was likely inevitable. Given how these situations typically unfold, if the store did close, there would be little chance I'd be transferred anywhere else. They would be more apt to lay me off entirely than go through the trouble of relocating me. So, I spent my evenings glancing at job listings, half expecting to find nothing of interest in a market already saturated with cheap, low-paying gigs. Then one ad had caught my eye. Honestly, I probably would have skimmed over it if it had provided more details, but the fact that it didn't say much was precisely what made me take notice. The ad read something like, "Job available, good pay, no benefits, discretion required." That was it. No further explanation of the position, no tantalizing bullet points, no exclamation marks announcing, "Apply now." And there wasn't even a phone number, just an email address. I remember sitting there thinking that the vagueness was either a big red flag or the sign of some interesting, maybe clandestine job. Perhaps it was a scam, or maybe even something illegal. My mother's voice in my mind warned me against chasing deals that were too good to be true. But then again, I was bored, curious, and unfulfilled at my current workplace. I was worried about my future, so I decided to send them a message. I emailed the address asking for more information, though I kept it brief so as not to appear overeager. In under half an hour, I received a response that said I was invited for a screening at a certain time and place. They included the address, an upscale office building across town, and instructions that I needed to be punctual, arriving exactly on the dot. Even then, part of me suspected that it was a hoax or some elaborate setup for a sales pitch. Still, what did I have to lose? My shift at the music store ended early enough that I could make the appointment. So I went. When I arrived, I found myself in a sleek, modern lobby. The floors were polished marble, the walls lined with tasteful modern art. It wasn't quite corporate, more like an architectural firm style, with hushed voices and sharp corners. I informed the receptionist that I had an appointment. She asked for my name, and upon confirming, she told me to have a seat. I waited for maybe 10 minutes, feeling the cool breath of the air conditioning across my face. Eventually, a staff member came out and led me to an unmarked office. He didn't introduce himself, which I found peculiar, but I tried to keep my composure, nodding politely as he ushered me inside. Once there, he handed me a stack of forms and questionnaires. These were fairly typical job application forms, but some of the questions were unusual. They asked for my thoughts on personal privacy, loyalty, trust, handling secrets, and how I reacted to morally ambiguous directives. One question asked me to describe a situation in which you were obligated to follow instructions that conflicted with your personal feelings or moral code. Another asked me if I would be willing to perform work duties that I might not fully understand, assuming they were legal. It felt a bit like some sort of personality test combined with a security clearance quiz. Yet, the forms offered no direct hint of what the job entailed. After submitting the forms, they told me politely that I would hear from them in a few weeks. And sure enough, I almost forgot about the entire event, believing it was probably a wild goose chase. But then about a month later, I received a phone call. It was around 8:00 p.m. on a Wednesday, and an unfamiliar number popped up on my phone screen. The person on the line introduced himself as Mr. Solomon, informed me that I had advanced to the next stage in the hiring process, and asked me to come to another address at a very specific time, 12:15 p.m. on a Thursday. He noted that punctuality was paramount, and to remember to bring no documents, no briefcase, and no portfolio. Just myself. That alone raised my eyebrows. Everything about this was growing stranger by the minute, yet my curiosity far outweighed my apprehension. The next day, I arrived at a different office complex, much like the first test. However, the style felt different, as though a completely different company managed this building. I was greeted by Mr. Solomon, a tall, trim man with silver hair and a sharp gray suit. He spoke in a measured, rhythmic manner, as though every word had been carefully practiced. He led me into a large, windowless room. Inside, All I saw was a single desk and a lone chair. On the desk were 2 large monitors, a simple keyboard and mouse, and a heavy bolted-down metal box with 2 conspicuously large push buttons, one red and one green. He indicated the ceiling where a small camera was mounted. He told me that everything I did in this room would be monitored. Then, he asked me if I understood the concept of redundancy. I nodded, even though his tone suggested he suspected I might not. I managed not to bristle at his condescending vibe. He proceeded to explain, if I accepted the job, I would be working 7 shifts per week, 6 hours each shift. The pay would be $35 an hour, and there would be no benefits. He emphasized that I was never to discuss my job responsibilities with anyone else, and never to disclose anything I might learn at work. The job requirements, as he described, were straightforward enough. I would show up 10 minutes early, enter a locker room area, and place all my personal items, wallet, phone, keys, into a locker. Then I would change into provided work clothes that had no pockets and enter the main surveillance room. The workspace, he explained, would look similar to the model I was in right then. There would be 2 monitors. The left monitor would show a constant live stream from a remote camera. My job would be to watch the feed. The right monitor would be a basic computer interface where I'd write an hourly log of anything I saw that seemed interesting or out of the ordinary. The metal box with the 2 buttons had a singular function. If I observed an immediate emergency on the feed or in the workspace itself, I was to press the red button. The green button was for instances of special significance in what I observed. Essentially, a silent alarm to alert the higher-ups that something noteworthy was happening. He gave an example. If the person or objects on screen did anything drastically unusual that required prompt reporting, I should press the green button. If something truly urgent or dangerous was happening, like a life-threatening event or the feed cutting out, I should press the red one. But mostly, I would just watch, type a log every hour, and press no buttons. The job was to remain vigilant, keep good notes, and maintain absolute discretion. $35 an hour seemed far too high for such a simplistic job. I pressed Solomon for explanations. Was this illegal? Was someone going to be harmed by my participation? He claimed no. He stated that the reason for the high pay was that the job demanded professional and consistent behavior. They required employees who would be discreet, reliable, and unmoved by curiosity. Moreover, there was a legal dimension to it, requiring me to sign documents acknowledging the confidentiality and the potential for criminal or civil lawsuits against me, should I violate it. Nothing about the interview settled my unease. Yet I recognized an opportunity. My music store job was going nowhere, and money doesn't exactly grow on trees. I decided I'd try it. Worst case scenario, if something truly shady happened, I could quit and hope to outrun any repercussions. But I chose to trust that, at face value, this might be some specialized corporate security or psychological research scenario. That kind of environment could pay well, and so I took the job. Quitting the music store with 0 notice made me feel guilty. My boss had always been kind to me, and the rest of the staff were my friends. Still, the gravity of my new position and the potential salary left me little room for sentimentalities. I signed the necessary papers. Another man from their HR, or so he presented himself, helped finalize everything, reminding me that discussing my work or what I might see would lead to dire consequences. The following week, on a Monday morning, I arrived for my first shift day. The facility that would now be my workplace was an anonymous, nondescript building. Frankly, it could have been a small warehouse or distribution center from the outside, though the windows were tinted or possibly false. Inside, I found a small reception area. A security guard behind glass buzzed me through. I proceeded to a small locker room, just as promised. Each locker had a coded lock. I chose a code, placed all my belongings inside, changed into the single-piece jumpsuit they provided, loose-fitting gray with no pockets, and stepped into the surveillance room. In person, it was almost identical to the test model. There was a water cooler in the corner and a small bathroom, but nothing else. Once I sat in the chair, the monitors flickered on automatically, displaying a request for me to verify my identity on the right monitor. The left monitor, however, showed a bedroom. It was relatively large, with a bed, a television, a sofa, a couple of chairs, and various knickknacks. Everything was brightly lit, suggesting either artificially bright overhead lights or some arrangement I couldn't quite see. The camera's angle was from a top corner of the room, so I got a panoramic view of almost everything. And most noticeable of all was the woman. She appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s, attractive in a soft, effortless way. On that first day, she was asleep on the sofa, facing away from the camera. I remember having an internal dialogue that went something like, "Oh my God, Am I a voyeur? Did she sign up for this? Is she a volunteer in some kind of research? Is she in trouble? What exactly am I looking at here? My mind raced through 100 scenarios, none of them reassuring. But the job was about observation. My instructions were to watch, keep notes, and not ask questions. Over the next several weeks, I pieced together a partial understanding of the situation. She, whom I mentally started calling Rachel, though I never learned her real name, seemed to live in that room. It was more like she was trapped there. I never saw any windows or a door from the camera's angle, so how did she get in and out? In time, I realized there must be a door on the wall, directly under the camera, or just outside its field of view. Every few days, people wearing sterile, featureless outfits, like gray jumpsuits of their own, but with face masks, would come in and escort her out. Sometimes, Rachel seemed cooperative, head hung low. Other times, she resisted. They would gently, but firmly, hold her arms and guide her away. After an hour or more, they'd bring her back. She never seemed physically harmed. I saw no bruises or outward injuries. Often, she appeared emotionally flat or distant, rather than terrified. She would sit on her bed, watch television, read books, paint, or just stare into space. Even as I witnessed these routines, I kept telling myself there might be an innocent explanation. Perhaps she was a psychiatric patient in a specialized facility. Possibly they were rehabilitating her from something, and I was just one small cog in a large system ensuring her well-being. Still, I couldn't shake the creeping sense that she was essentially a captive. I weighed my moral responsibilities. Maybe I should press the red button or call the police. But the fear for my personal safety, and for my livelihood, held me back. I also rationalized that I'd see if anything too extreme happened. If someone hurt her, if she begged for mercy, I'd intervene. The job had redundancies. I was told others watched too. Maybe doctors, scientists, or colleagues behind the scenes. If it was legal, if it was an agreed-upon experiment, then my meddling would be unwelcome. If it wasn't legal, pressing that red button might do little good. I was caught in a web of indecision. Those early months were tense, but eventually a routine formed. I arrived, stored my items, put on the jumpsuit, and entered the surveillance room. I watched Rachel for 6 hours at a time, typing logs every hour. The logs were generally mundane. 2 p.m., 3:00 p.m. Subject painted on canvas. Subject then watched television. Nothing else significant. 10:00 m. 11:00 a.m. Subject read a book, presumably a paperback. Could not identify the title. No visitors. Every so often, the masked figures would come. I tracked how often that happened, but I almost never hit the green button because Solomon had made it clear. Only press it if something genuinely noteworthy occurs, something that's not just routine. And from what I gathered, her being taken out was standard, so I never flagged it. As for the red button, I never found anything that reached the threshold of a true emergency. That is, not until far later. One detail that helped ease my conscience was observing that Rachel wasn't living in abject misery. She had food. Someone must have stocked a refrigerator or arranged for her meals, though I never saw the process. She also had hobbies like reading and painting, and she showed a measure of calm. There were days she even smiled, such as when she watched comedic movies on television. She'd laugh or grin, and I felt a pang of something close to guilt for prying on her private life, but also relief that she was, at least outwardly, okay. Time passed, and after 6 months, I grew more comfortable with the job. Initially, I had dreaded that they might rotate me or promote me, or ask me to do more, but that never happened. Instead, I was left alone. In the locker room, I occasionally bumped into another employee coming or going from a separate shift. We rarely spoke, just gave each other tight-lipped nods. Everyone understood the unspoken rules. Don't chat about your shift. Don't mention what you saw. Maintain the secret. The job's monotony was occasionally broken by a random test from management. For instance, once or twice the feed would glitch, or the lights in my surveillance room would flicker, presumably to see if I pressed the red button. But as time went on, it stayed quiet. I became accustomed to watching Rachel paint. That might sound creepy, but it was a highlight of my day. Seeing her creativity unfold, she used a range of colors and styles. Sometimes her work was almost impressionistic. Other times it was more literal but contained swirling tendrils of color that gave it a surreal flair. I couldn't see the finished product very well, because she usually painted with the canvas turned away from the camera. Yet on the rare occasions I did see glimpses, I was enthralled by her talent. Then, roughly 2.5 years into the job, I had a revelation that something was deeply off. I mean, it was already suspicious, but I had compartmentalized it to avoid losing my mind. This time, the feeling was too blatant to ignore. Rachel's routine changed. The first sign was that she started painting much more frequently, often for hours on end. It wasn't just a random shift in her schedule. She seemed compelled, almost frantic, and there was none of the usual tranquility in her eyes. Her posture was tense, her brushstrokes forceful. The once gentle swirl of colors seemed to become more intense, as though she were pouring desperation onto the canvas. On the first day this happened, I rationalized that maybe she'd found new inspiration, or that a caretaker or doctor had told her to increase her productivity, but it escalated. Over 3 days, she churned out 4 paintings. Each time she finished a painting, she'd prop it up facing her on a piece of furniture. The second or third day, she rearranged them on the sofa at the far side of the room. This was the first real chance I had to see them fully from the vantage point of the camera. The display was mesmerizing. 4 scenes that at first glance seemed to have no thematic connection. A lush green forest, full of layered detail and crawling vines. An old stone well, surrounded by tall grass. A lone house on a small island, its windows glowing with soft light. A quaint, old-fashioned movie theater sign and facade. Each painting had these drifting lines of color in the background, swirling like ribbons caught in a breeze. I found it beautiful, but also slightly unnerving. Like each painting was half in reality and half in some dream world. Then, as I leaned in, I noticed something else. Those swirling lines weren't random. They formed letters. More specifically, they formed words. The merging colors spelled out fleeting hints of text. At first, I thought I was mistaken, but after a moment, I realized I could read them. They were so subtle that you could only see them if you tilted your head and squinted at the screen. I read them, left to right, top pair of paintings and then bottom pair. Please, help. May. Thomas. My stomach dropped. My name is Thomas. There was no reason for her to know my name. At least, logically, she shouldn't have been able to know it, unless someone told her, or she somehow guessed. The abruptness of it felt like a direct punch to my gut. My mind immediately whirled with questions. Was it a coincidence that the name Thomas appeared in her painting? Possibly it was a name in a story she'd read or a person from her past. But in combination with, please help me, and the frantic style, it felt like she was sending me a direct message. It was as if she had discovered that I was there, or at least that someone named Thomas was watching. Maybe the watchers who escorted her in and out had let something slip. Maybe she'd overheard my name. The idea that she specifically wanted me, Thomas, to rescue her was terrifying and compelling at once. I pushed back from my monitor, heart hammering in my chest, 1,000 thoughts careening around in my head. The illusions I'd built up about her being a voluntary participant, or about me having no moral obligation, began crumbling. Clearly, she was being detained against her will. She needed help, and for whatever reason, she had decided to reach out to me. That moment, I nearly pressed the red button, but I paused, remembering that it triggered an emergency response from the same people presumably holding her captive. Was that wise? Would that help her or only make things worse? I hovered my hand over the red button, physically trembling. Then, in an impulsive act, I pulled away. I thought, I should wait to see if there's more clarity in what she's doing. If I sound the alarm without more context, I might be discovered as sympathetic to her and lose my chance to help. Because if these people could orchestrate a facility to hold her, they could easily make me disappear. I needed to tread carefully. The next day, I arrived at my shift with a racing pulse, half expecting them to say, "We know what you saw. You're fired." But the guard at the reception area buzzed me in as usual. In the locker room, nobody said a word to me. My code opened the locker, same as ever. When I entered the surveillance room, all was normal. The left monitor flicked on, and there was Rachel, painting again, though I couldn't tell the subject yet. My immediate thought was, this is real. It wasn't a dream. And oh God, I felt guilty. I was complicit. I felt dirty for just sitting there, a paid voyeur, while a woman pleaded for my help. All shift long, she worked on another painting, the 5th in as many days. After maybe 3 hours, she dragged it over to the sofa, placing it among the others, adjusting them so I could see. Sure enough, this 5th painting showed a wide meadow with tall grass waving under a purple sky. And in the swirl of colors across that purple sky was a single word. Please. She paused, glanced around the room like someone searching for a camera. She was definitely trying to communicate. My chest tightened painfully. Throughout that shift, I watched with bated breath, wondering what to do. This time, however, she didn't hide the painting from me. It was angled, so I could clearly see her message. She'd apparently decided to keep repeating the plea until I responded. But how was I supposed to respond? Normally, I typed an hourly log about her activities, but those logs were presumably reviewed by the same people who kept her locked up. If I tried to write, "She's asking for my help," Would that do anything but blow my cover? On top of the moral quandary was the personal danger. If these captors realized I was sympathetic, they could do any number of terrible things to me. They had the resources to hold her all this time. They could easily vanish me as well. Yet, the alternative, doing nothing, felt increasingly heinous. That afternoon, after my shift, I returned home in a daze. I couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate. My mind conjured paranoid visions. Black SUVs rolling up to my door, men in suits snatching me away because I dared question or talk about the job. Should I quit and run far away? But that left Rachel trapped with no recourse. And the job paid so well? It had basically become my livelihood. I was torn between self-preservation and the duty to help a fellow human. Over the following week, Rachel doubled down on her efforts. She created a flurry of paintings, each with cryptic or overt messages. Some spelled out, alone. Some spelled please. And in at least two, I spotted Thomas carefully hidden in the background. I began to suspect she was gifted with some heightened sense, or had gleaned information from the staff. At times, she would sit on her bed, eyes locked right at the camera, as though she knew I was there. Beyond that lens, watching, it felt like she was pleading silently, even if she couldn't see me in return. The sense of desperation in her paintings grew. The brushstrokes became more frantic, and her posture more haggard. Finally, on a Thursday afternoon, something dramatically changed. I was half an hour into my shift, scanning the monitor absently. Rachel had finished another painting, this one of a giant tree standing against a gray sky, with swirling lines that spelled, I know. That unsettled me even more than her previous messages. What did she know? Did she know about me? Or did she know something about the place that was holding her captive? A few minutes after she finished the painting, the door under the camera's blind spot opened. 3 masked figures entered, more than the usual 1 or 2. Rachel's posture stiffened. She shook her head, stepping backward. They advanced and she started shouting, though the feed had no audio, so I couldn't hear her words. Her face contorted with genuine panic, tears streaming. This was not the subdued compliance I often saw. It was raw terror. As they seized her arms, she tried to rip free, flailing in desperation. One of them produced a syringe and injected something into her neck. Her movement slowed, but she was still conscious, still struggling. My heart thundered as I witnessed this assault. This had never happened on my shifts before. The next moment, she looked directly at the camera, eyes brimming with horror, mouth moving in silent words. I saw her lips form something that looked a lot like help, please. Then they dragged her out of frame. I jumped out of my chair so violently that I nearly toppled it over. My instincts screamed, press the red button. But would that help? The red button alerted these same people that something was going on. They were the ones hurting her. I hovered there, trembling, trying to reason through it. If I pressed the button, yes, it might bring them rushing into my surveillance room, but maybe that was better than doing nothing. Alternatively, if I pressed the green button, I'd simply be alerting them to something interesting. That was useless at best, sinister at worst. I realized that if these captors had any sense, they'd scrub the logs or punish me for pressing the red button at the wrong time. Still, my moral sense insisted that inaction was unacceptable. She was being forcibly medicated and taken away against her will. That was definitely an emergency by any humane standard, even if the policy said otherwise. I slammed my palm down on the red button, half expecting the monitors to flicker off or some alarm to ring. Instead, there was no immediate effect. The overhead camera's red light blinked. Perhaps a signal had been sent. A moment later, the door to my surveillance room clicked open. I whipped around to see Mr. Solomon standing there, accompanied by 2 new faces I'd never seen before. An older man in a business suit and a younger woman in a clinical white coat. Mr. Solomon wore a neutral expression. What's the issue, Thomas? He asked quietly. My heart was still pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I gestured frantically at the monitor. They took her, injected her. She didn't want it to go. It looked violent, and she seemed terrified. He followed my gaze to the monitor, which now showed an empty room with a knocked-over table and the new painting left behind. His stoic gaze never wavered. Yes, he said. It's an unfortunate measure we sometimes have to employ to keep her calm. You're not to press the red button over routine sedation. That's when the full weight of how far gone the situation was slammed into me. He was calling that a routine sedation. My mouth opened, but words failed me. The older man spoke up, calmly stating that they appreciated my vigilance, but that my role was to remain objective and refrain from interfering unless there was a substantial threat to the facility or to Rachel's immediate health. According to him, sedation was not harm. It was medical procedure. The woman in the lab coat nodded, backing up his statement. She said something about the subject's well-being being their top concern, and that I wasn't to question the methods employed. I wanted to scream at them. You're kidnapping and drugging someone. How is that not harming her? But fear strangled the words in my throat. I worried they had the power to end me if I pushed back too strongly. Instead, I stood there in shaky silence. Solomon looked disappointed in me, as though I'd failed a test. Eventually, he told me that pressing the red button for this reason was understandable but misguided, though they would not penalize me. He made it clear that continuing to do so, or creating further disruptions, would lead to disciplinary action or termination. Then they directed me to keep the log note minimal. There's no need to dwell on this, Solomon said with a tight smile. Just note that she was taken for medical treatment. They handed me a typed piece of paper with an exact sentence to enter in the log. Then, the three of them left as swiftly as they had appeared. I sank back into my chair, numb with shock. For the remaining 4 hours of my shift, I stared at an empty room on the monitor, the new painting of the giant tree left behind. My gaze kept drifting to that swirl of color near the upper corner that spelled, I know. Whatever she knew was overshadowed by my revelation. These people were far from benign. The sedation was direct evidence that they would use force to subdue her. My illusions about a possibly humane experiment or a voluntary arrangement crumbled. Still, I didn't contact the police or walk out. I was petrified. If these people had that level of organization, and that many resources, they likely had deep pockets and connections that might protect them from any police inquiry. Perhaps they had official sanction. I weighed the risk of me becoming their next victim if I became troublesome. And so, with trembling hands, I typed the given sentence into the log, concluding that shift in a daze of cowardice and despair. Over the next few days, I watched the feed, anxiously, half expecting her to be missing, or in worse shape. To my mixed relief, she was brought back, apparently unharmed aside from looking exhausted and emotionally frazzled. She no longer painted for long stretches, though, instead, she spent hours staring at the camera, her eyes filled with haunted sorrow. She must have known I'd witnessed that ordeal. I found myself whispering apologies to the screen she'd never hear, tears pricking at my eyes. A week passed without further escalations, but the paintings depicting "Help Me, Thomas" remained strewn along the sofa. Nobody came in to remove them. Perhaps that was deliberate, a message to me that they were aware of what she painted. Maybe they wanted me to see how powerless I was. My sense of guilt grew. She was still calling to me for rescue, and I had done nothing but press a button that triggered more watchers to come in and dismiss my concerns. If she truly believed I could help her, she must be so disappointed, maybe even thinking I had abandoned her. It was then that I realized the only moral path was to act, but carefully. I needed more information first. My best chance was to continue as usual and see if there was a weakness in their system. Possibly I could collect evidence, maybe by memorizing details from the feed, like the layout of her room or any distinguishing features that might locate it geographically. If I got that data to the authorities, they might find her. But there were obstacles. For one, the facility had strict rules about bringing nothing in or out. I couldn't take screenshots, couldn't carry a phone or camera inside. I had no pen or paper to jot down the details. So I started using memory techniques, a trick I'd read about in a random article years ago. By mentally associating each piece of data with vivid images or stories, I could store a surprising amount of detail in my head. Every shift, I made note of subtle aspects. The color of the bedspread, the patterns on the tile floor, the brands of bottled water I sometimes glimpsed on her nightstand, the shapes of the ventilation grill's walls. This was all guesswork. I didn't even know if it would matter. But maybe the brand of water was sold only in certain areas. Or maybe the location of that ventilation shaft could hint at the building's architecture. I needed anything that might help the police. Yet I was also keenly aware that if I turned over my precious mental notes too soon, and they turned out worthless, I'd just tip off the captors that I was trying to help her, and I'd lose my chance. Time dragged on. I grew more and more stressed, barely sleeping, often skipping meals. My fiancé, who knew I was working some specialized security gig, began to worry about my constant anxiety. But I couldn't tell her the truth. Finally, after 2 more weeks of no major changes, I decided that I couldn't simply wait for something to happen. I needed to attempt a real plan. That meant reaching out to the police or an investigative journalist. But how do I do that without exposing my role? The day before I planned to make my move was the day Rachel did something new that both terrified and revitalized my sense of purpose. She had resumed painting, more methodically this time. When she finished, she held the canvas up directly toward the camera. It was a depiction of a locked door. On the door's surface, in bright red letters, were the words, "Help me, or they kill me soon. My blood froze. That message was unequivocal. She believed her life was in imminent danger. Whether that was truly the captor's intention or she had gleaned it from eavesdropping, I had no way of knowing. But her urgency was real. Enough was enough. I spent that entire shift rattled, my heart pounding, my mind imagining how to approach the police or an attorney. Maybe I should waltz into a police station and say, "I watch a captive woman on camera. I think she's in a hidden facility. Please help me." But then I risked sounding insane. Who would believe me without proof? That night, I got home and typed an anonymous email to a major local news outlet, offering to provide information about a secret detainee. I also considered contacting a private investigator, but I didn't trust random names from an online listing. Worst case scenario, the investigator might be connected to these captors, or I might blow my cover prematurely. What happened the next day, however, rendered those half-formed strategies moot. I arrived at the surveillance room early as usual, but when the monitors turned on, I was greeted with a horrifying sight. Rachel lying on the floor, unmoving. My heart slammed into my ribs. The camera angle showed her face. Her eyes were open but unblinking. My immediate thought was that she was dead, maybe from a heart attack or an overdose. Panicked, I nearly slammed the red button again. Then, to my relief, I saw her exhale, her chest rising slightly. She was alive but seemingly unconscious or in a stupor. Something was off. There were injection marks on her arms that hadn't been there before. I felt physically ill. Was this the fate she had predicted? A step in the captors ending her life, or drugging her to a final degree? I hammered the red button again, ignoring my prior warnings. If she was in danger of dying, that had to be an emergency. Within a minute, the door opened, and in walked two men I recognized, along with the older man from last time. They glared at me. The older man barked that everything was under control, that I was not to interfere. I pointed at the screen, yelling, "She's not moving. You have to help her." They insisted she was under sedation for a medical procedure, and that I must not hinder them. My vision swam as hot anger and fear churned inside me. I knew they were lying. This wasn't just sedation. She looked near death. I demanded an ambulance be called. They refused. Then, one of the men told me I was dismissed for the day. My shift was over. When I tried to argue, the older man gave me a look so cold it froze the words in my throat. He quietly said, "Thomas, I suggest you go home." His tone was mild, but the threat was clear. If I stayed, I might not get out unscathed. I stumbled out of the building, my mind screaming that Rachel was on the verge of dying. That's when the dam finally broke inside me. I realized that protecting my own safety meant leaving her to perish at their hands. I couldn't do it. If I'd let it go on so long, it was because I was afraid to face the truth. I was complicit, but no more. That night, I went to a friend, someone who'd worked in local law enforcement, and, without naming specifics, asked hypothetically how I'd blow the whistle on a potentially illegal operation. He looked at me curiously and told me I needed evidence, something tangible, to ensure the police took me seriously and to ensure I wouldn't be dismissed as a crank or get myself sued for defamation if it turned out false. "Get documents," he said. "Record conversations, or take video." But I told him I had no way to do that. It was then that I realized I might already be in far deeper danger. If these people discovered I was seeking outside help, they could harm me or my loved ones. I didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, I decided to gather my courage, go in, see if I could confirm Rachel's condition, and if she was still alive, I'd create a pretext to help her. The idea was to press the red button for an actual reason, like if I could get into the hallway or cause a commotion. Maybe I'd attempt to forcibly remove her from that place. It was an insane plan, and likely doomed, but I felt an urgency that overshadowed caution. Yet when I arrived that morning, the building was dark and locked down now. The security guard was gone. The front door was sealed. After trying for several minutes to get in, it was clear that the entire facility was abandoned. I peered through the tinted windows, but everything inside appeared stripped, like they had vanished overnight. My heart pounded as I circled the perimeter, searching for a side entrance. All locked. I texted one coworker's number I had from a brief shift overlap months earlier. No response. Panic overwhelmed me. Rachel was inside, maybe dying, or perhaps they relocated her. I spent hours that day making calls to random offices in the same office park, but nobody had a clue about an operation matching the building's description. The landlord or property manager told me that the building had been leased out by a shell company that canceled the lease unexpectedly. They had no forwarding information. Desperate, I contacted the local police. I told them everything, albeit it in a somewhat abbreviated form. The officer on the line sounded skeptical but took my statement. When they arrived, I pointed out the building. They walked around, checked that it was indeed locked, confirmed it was empty. The officer gave me a patronizing look, as though suspecting I might be on drugs or mentally unstable. I tried to remain calm, but I was frantic, insisting there was a woman trapped inside. The police eventually forced open a side entrance. We went in together. The building was empty, utterly bare. No desks, no surveillance room, no electronics, just a cavernous interior that smelled faintly of bleach and industrial cleaning supplies. The officer gave me a final, "You better not waste my time again," glare. And that was it. They left me standing alone in the parking lot. That was nearly a month ago, and I've heard no follow-up from any law enforcement. If anything, I suspect they wrote me off as a delusional crank. So here I am, forced to break every non-disclosure agreement I signed, hoping that by going public anonymously, I might stir some attention. If anyone reading this has encountered anything similar, or if some investigative journalist can pick up the trail, maybe Rachel can be found. I still wrestle nightly with guilt, imagining her last painting. "Help me or they kill me soon." I failed her. I let them vanish without a trace. Why am I posting this now? Because I keep receiving emails from unknown addresses. Cryptic messages like, "We know what you did," or "You are not safe." Whether they're from the captors or just a sick prank, I can't be sure. But they indicate that someone is aware. I tried to blow the whistle. Fear still gnaws at me, but I'm determined not to let it paralyze me again. My best hope of protection might be ensuring the truth is out there, so that if something happens to me, people will know that I was onto something biggie. And maybe, just maybe, if enough eyes are turned toward this story, some piece of evidence or clue will surface that can help find Rachel and set her free. Wow. All the rationalizations and excuses I once told myself, that she was part of an experiment, that it was all legal, that I was protecting her in some backhanded way, are meaningless now. The bottom line is she was a prisoner, and I didn't act decisively until it was too late. So if you're reading this, believe me when I say that moral complacency is a dangerous thing. You can convince yourself of anything for a paycheck. The only question is, at what point do you admit the truth and do what's right? I have no illusions that I'll ever see her again. I only pray that this message reaches someone who can help unravel the twisted network behind her captivity. If you see a suspicious facility that looks like it could hold such a surveillance setup, or if you have any knowledge of a person forcibly confined in a comfortable yet sealed environment, please take it seriously. Investigate. Do what I was too cowardly to do for so many months. Because the difference between a captive's rescue and a tragedy might come down to a single brave action at the critical moment. To this day, I replay the memory of Rachel's face, full of terror and silent pleas, over and over in my head. Sometimes, I dream of her paintings, the swirling colors spelling out my name. In the dreams, I press the red button sooner, or I smash through the walls of the facility, or I orchestrate some cunning plan. But it's always just a dream. In waking life, I live with the knowledge that I allowed it to go on far too long, and I can't erase that guilt, no matter how many times I say I'm sorry. For whatever it's worth, I'm posting this lengthy account in the hope that someone, somewhere, might take notice. If by some miracle Rachel is still alive, she deserves a real chance at freedom. I owe her that much, and I owe it to myself to stand up against the fear that kept me silent. Please, if you suspect anything like this around you, or if you come across a clue that matches these details, don't turn away. Do something more than I did. Because while my job was watching a woman trapped in a room, what I should have done from the beginning was find a way to get her out.